Hello, hello! I'm so excited you're here. Welcome to Master Wire Jewelry. I can't believe we're here. We're on video 1, module 1. Today I want to talk to you in detail about wire. There are so many different types of wire. During this course you will see me use solid copper wire most of the time. The reason that I'm going to encourage all of you to start with something like copper or brass is simply the price point. While you're learning, you're going to make a few pieces that, you know, as artists, we're always our worst critic. And it's not the end of the world if you have to start with a new piece of wire if you're working with copper, because it just doesn't cost that much. If you jump right into something like sterling silver, then, you know, I don't want you to cry if you mess up. And you're going to mess up once or twice, and that's okay. You got to embrace that. So this is a solid copper wire. Remember, maybe from my emails, I mentioned there are 4 words you will see when shopping for wire. They are coated, plated, filled, and solid. So those are the 4 kind of different wires. This is solid, meaning 100% of this wire is copper. This is the same material that electrical wire is. Electrical wire has to be 100% copper, same as this. Otherwise the electricity just won't flow. So you can use old electrical wire, but know that the temper isn't going to be the same as these. These are dead soft, and so they're nice and soft and easy to work with, ready to go. Whereas if you have an electrical wire and you have to strip the coating off the outside, maybe if you use fire to do that and then it'll anneal the copper inside while you're stripping it, then you'll have a nice soft wire, but you'll probably have to clean it afterwards, and then you're looking at some pickle and some acids, but that's getting way ahead of myself. Right now I just want to talk about the solid copper wire. I also have some brass wire. Brass is a little bit harder than copper, but is also a nice affordable wire to work with when you're getting started. So if this is a color you like, by all means. This is some brass that I picked up while traveling in India. It's a little bit tarnished, so it's not quite as bright as this brass here that is an American-made spool. But both of these are also solid wire. They are 100% brass. Brass is an alloy of copper and, now I'm going to get this wrong, I want to say zinc actually, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So brass is an alloy, that's what makes this color. The only thing that's naturally this color is gold. But brass is an old alloy that we've been using for a long time. And it's also a really nice, wonderful, warm color. Sticking with my solid wires, I've got this spool here, which is something else I picked up while traveling in India. It's actually a half round wire, so it's kind of a fun shape. It's a little bit tarnished and dirty, but it's actually a solid wire, but it's not sterling silver. It's what they call a white metal. Sometimes you get this stuff in South America and it's called alpaca. Sometimes it's called white metal. Sometimes it's called German silver, which doesn't usually actually have any silver in it. So it goes by different names, and sometimes the alloy in this can be slightly different, but it is also zinc and copper, I believe. So it's also an alloy, and it's made to look like sterling silver, but at a much, much lower price point. It's sometimes hard to source this stuff in North America, but it's another alternative for a solid wire that's in an affordable price range. I've got a piece over here. It's really dark because I've had it kicking around for a while. So it's tarnished. But this is silver filled wire. There's an SF here. That's silver filled, 18 gauge. So, and it has a 1/10. That means 1/10 of this wire is silver. So it's got a much, much thicker layer of silver than a plated wire. So this is silver filled wire. You probably won't find this really easily too. You have to go to a jewelry supply company to find filled wire. But it's okay that it tarnishes like this. It's got a thick enough layer of silver that I can clean this off, and there's still going to be a thick layer of silver there. If this was plated wire and it was plated with sterling silver and it was tarnished like this, I mean, I could clean it a few times, but every time you clean it, you actually take a tiny little microscopic layer of silver away, and when you don't start with much silver, it's easy to wear right through that plating. So filled doesn't do that. Filled is got a much thicker layer of silver on the outside, but it's still copper on the inside, so it is not a solid wire. So that's my filled wire. What else do we have over here? These are a couple of spools that came straight from China. They are copper wire. It even says copper wire on this guy here. But one is a silver color and one is a brass color. So these have some kind of plating. This one probably isn't plated with sterling silver. This one is probably a copper wire plated with a white metal. So this is like a super, super cheap wire in a silver color. You know, it's great for learning with, okay? But the jewelry you make with any kind of plated wire is not gonna hold up. Eventually you're gonna be able to see the copper wire underneath. Same with this stuff. I would much rather buy and use a solid brass wire than a plated brass wire, because this is gonna stay the same color through the life of the jewelry. This is gonna change color as that plating wears off. So those are plated with other metal colors. I've got a couple other spools here. These have really hard, like baked on, I don't know, enamel plating on them. And they're cool. They're cool colors. It's a lot of fun to work with them. But if your tool mark slips, now it's not going to do it. Here we go. I just scratched a whole big piece of that plating off of there. Can you see that? There it is. Because, you know, your tool can slip sometimes, and then you can see the copper wire underneath. So again, sometimes it's fun to work with some of these colored wires. But again, I tend to not permanent colored wire, I'm reading that, sorry. I tend to not like these wires myself, because again, they're not going to stay with these colors. As long as they don't scratch, these colors are great. They do stay for a long time. But as soon as they're scratched, either in the making or the wearing of the piece, then you're down to the copper, and you're going to be able to see that. And there's no way to really fix that short of starting over with a new piece of wire. So by all means, play with these. They're a lot of fun to add color to your designs, but know that there are hazards with these. If you're selling your jewelry especially and you can't control the conditions that it's being worn under, I wouldn't use wire like this, because you're just going to have unhappy customers that don't know the difference. Okay? Let's see, I've gone over a whole bunch of these. I've got some sterling silver wire here. It often just says SS for sterling silver. This is a half round, and I've got some round wire. This comes in all different shapes, all different thicknesses. This is what I mostly use in my jewelry. I love sterling silver. I love the way it looks, and so that's been my preferred metal. And I've made the decision in my jewelry to go a little higher end and to use solid wire rather than filled. I had to order that one spool of filled just to see, just to check it out, because, you know, I'm curious, and that's the only way to know. But in the end, I decided, even though I spend a lot more money on my wire, sometimes I can spend over $1,000 US just to buy wire, which is a bit ridiculous, but it means I can charge more for my pieces because I do sell them. And I really like the feeling of selling the solid sterling silver, knowing that there's no coating or layers that are gonna wear away. One more, I do have one roll of Argentium wire. I haven't used this yet, but Argentium is very similar to sterling silver. It's mostly silver. However, ARG is Argentium. It has, instead of copper, sterling silver is silver and copper, 92.5% silver, 7.5% copper. Argentium, though I don't know exactly the ratio, has no copper in it. Instead, it has germanium, which is another element, I believe, off the periodic table. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm not a scientist. But because it's a slightly different alloy than the sterling silver, it does not tarnish, or at least it's not supposed to tarnish. This is a fairly new roll. I haven't had a chance to use it yet. I wanted to make some ear wires out of this, which is why I ordered hard. But, you know, lots of things to do, so I haven't gotten there yet. So anyway, Argentium, if you don't like the way that silver tarnishes, then you can maybe try Argentium. It's the same price range as sterling silver. However, I have chosen again not to use Argentium because it won't antique like sterling silver. I really like how the sterling silver antiques, and this won't do that because it doesn't tarnish. Okay, one last thing. I wanted to bring in some memory wire. Memory wire is kind of like a slinky. It's a steel, high tensile steel wire. So that means it's not made of the same materials as any of these other wires. It means it's a lot harder, and it's about as hard as this wire can get, which is why it maintains this shape. They use these like just by stringing beads on them, and then like this is for a bracelet. Let's see if I can make it go on, and you kind of spiral it on, and you make these bracelets, these beaded bracelets that are just worn like this. So the reason I'm even mentioning this, because you don't want to use memory wire for any of the type of wire working that we're going to do in this course. So the only reason I'm even mentioning this is because if you run across this and you're like, I'm going to play with this, that's fine. But do not use your regular flesh cutters to cut this stuff. This stuff will destroy your flesh cutters. It'll put a little wire-sized lump right in the cutting jaws and will just completely wreck your cutters. So either get your, husband or your partner's industrial strength cutters that are meant for steel, or if you see them, buy a set of memory wire shears, which is meant for cutting this stuff. But do not use your good flesh cutters to cut memory wire. It will just destroy your flesh cutters. And there's nothing worse than spending a bunch of money on a good tool just to wreck it. So that's the only reason I'm even mentioning memory wire. It can be fun for a simple project, but stay away from it. It's not going to be any good for what we're doing in this course. So that's a rundown on some of the different types of wire that I just happen to have kicking around my shop and that I have played with. There are even more wires than this. I don't have any silver-plated wire. I don't have any gold-plated wire. There are other types of wires out there besides even this. I would never use, for example, a hay wire or a galvanized wire from the hardware store, because those two wires have iron in them. Well, the tie wire, the hay wire, has iron in it and it will rust. The galvanized wire, galvanized is a process full of chemicals and heat, and you don't want to be wearing a galvanized wire next to your skin. That's not going to be good for your health long term. Beyond that, though, I hope I've helped you decide on what kind of wire you want to buy. I always personally recommend solid wire, because then when your tool slips and you have a tool mark, you can take some sandpaper or a file and get rid of that mark completely, rather than having to grab a new piece of wire because you've damaged the finish on it. So that's my 2 cents. Take it or leave it. The one thing I would mention about any kind of coated wire is if you have sensitivities to copper. Sometimes people turn green when they wear copper. This is actually an indication that you have a high acidity level in your body, and is actually something that you should address to be just a healthier person. So in Ayurveda, they actually use copper wire as a way to tell the acidity level in your body. So if you're one of these people that just can't wear copper and you don't want to address your acidity level, then you might consider using a coated wire, just so you don't react to the copper, both when you're making and when you're wearing your pieces. But I know there's lots of other people out there that just love the warm look of copper. And if that's the case, embrace it and enjoy. Most of the wire that I showed you so far has been round wire. There's been the odd exception where I've shown you a half round wire. Now everything's tangled up. And a half round wire is basically, sometimes they refer to it as a D wire. Can you focus on that? But it's basically a round wire that's been actually cut in half. There. Really doesn't want to focus on that, I'm sorry. So this has lots of applications, ring bands and different things. Sometimes you just need a flat side on your wire to grip onto other things. So I use half round wire all the time. So we've got round wire, we've got half round wire, we've got square wire, literally a square. This is really attractive when it gets twisted, because you've got those flat sides that get twisted. I'll show you that in the beginner pendant wrap. I think that's module 2. I think that's module 2. So square wire is a lot of fun too. And again, all of these shapes come in different gauges. So I will talk about gauges in a minute. I've got here a piece of rectangle wire where it's much wider than it is thick. Sometimes these are good for different projects. You can get these in all different sizes. I've got some bezel wire here, which is really narrow one way, and really it's even a more extreme rectangle. A bezel is when you go around the edge of a cabochon stone, they call it a bezel. So this is what they use for a traditional soldered setting. We're not going to use any bezel wire in this course, but I just want to show you there are all different types. This is also another bezel wire, and if you can see that, it's actually got a fat bit on the bottom. Can we get you to focus? There, a fat bit on the bottom and a really narrow bit poking up from that. So this is another type of bezel wire that I actually haven't used yet, but I just want to demonstrate that you can get all different shapes. This is also sterling silver, and it's a tube. Really having trouble with the focusing here. But anyway, so there's lots of different shapes of wire. I also wanted to talk to you about wire gauges. It's kind of confusing because of all of the different countries that have all of the different systems, but for everywhere that uses wire gauges, the higher the number, the smaller the wire. I'm trying to find the end of my 22 gauge here. I don't know where it is. It must be tucked in here. So this is a 22 gauge wire and this is a 16 gauge wire. Even on film here you can see the difference in thickness. And this is really confusing. I've even met wire workers who are like, it's a conspiracy. Why do they have to make it so confusing for us? But I wanted to show you this tool here. This is a draw plate. This is a cheap draw plate that I got from India. But this is the magical tool that they use to make wire. And unfortunately, it was the wire makers that got to name the gauges rather than the wire workers. So I'm not going to really use this much. This is a cheap gauger that I got in India, and I've already chipped one of the holes when I tried using it. So if you are going to get one of these, spend a few extra bucks, get a really good quality one made with really good quality steel, because as soon as you get holes chipping out of here like this, it makes kind of just a gouge along your wire as you make it. But anyway, how this works is these aren't just any old holes. You'll notice that they're bigger on one side than they are on the other, so they're tapered. They're tapered holes. And so you actually pull your wire through these holes, and in fact, if you take it right from the wire scraps, so all the tails that we're going to create and all the extra wire that's been all mangled and has a hard temper and we don't want to use it again, we collect that up, and then we can melt it down in a crucible, liquefy it, pour it into an ingot, a bar, and that bar gets put through a rolling mill where it gets rolled down to basically a 0 gauge. Once you've got a 0 gauge, which is quite a thick wire, you start pulling it through your draw plate. So you want to mount your draw plate in like a vise or something really solid, and then you need a really good pair of draw pliers that have really good grips on them, and you can really have a strong grip on them. And you basically like hammer the end of your wire so that's just a little bit narrower, and then you start putting it through these holes. This one, it obviously, you need to find the right hole for the next size down. But the more holes that you pull the wire through, the smaller the gauge. So a 16 gauge wire has been pulled through 16 holes, whereas a 22 gauge wire has been pulled through 22 holes, which is why it's a smaller wire. Once you understand this system of how they make wire, the gauging system actually makes a lot more sense and is way, way less confusing. So even if you never ever use a draw plate yourself, which is totally fine, I want you to understand how they make wire so that you can understand why the gauges are labeled the way they are. So that's why the higher the gauge number, the smaller the wire, because it's just been pulled through more holes. So, dun, da, 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 I hope you learned something today. I think that wraps it up on my spiel about wire. I will make another video on temper, and then we're going to get into the tools. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.